You're good to go, Vince? All right, good morning, everyone. I will call this meeting of the Standing Committee on Government Operations back to order. My name is Rylund Johnson. I'm the MLA for Yellowknife North and chair of this committee. Today we will be reviewing the 2020-2021 public accounts with the Office of the Auditor General and GNWT Comptroller General. I will begin with asking committee members to introduce themselves, beginning on my left.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
Caitlin Cleveland, MLA Cam Lake.
Thank you very much. We are also joined today by our clerk Taylor and our research staff Nigel. With that, I would like to welcome the Office of the Auditor General, Sophie Miller, Assistant Auditor General. I will turn it over to you and ask you to introduce your team and begin with any remarks you have.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And also thank you for the opportunity to discuss our audit of the consolidated financial statements of the Government of the Northwest Territories for the 2020-2021 fiscal year. I want to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional unceded territory of the Yellowknives Dene First Nation. I am accompanied by Lana Dar, who was the principal responsible for the audit, and Kelsey Hogg, who was the auditor. As the auditor of the Government of the Northwest Territories, our primary responsibility is to audit the government's consolidated financial statements and express an opinion on them. As legislative auditors, we also report on the government's compliance with financial and legal authorities, such as the Financial Administration Act. The committee's review of the public accounts of the Government of the Northwest Territories is an important step in ensuring accountability and transparency for how public funds are spent and how government finances are reported. I am pleased that the committee is holding this hearing to examine the government's financial results. The government carries out its accounting and financial reporting responsibilities through the Office of the Comptroller General within the Department of Finance. The Comptroller General will answer questions about the preparation of the financial statements. We will focus on our audit. Our independent auditor's report is on pages 10 to 13 in Section 1 of the Public Accounts of the Government of the Northwest Territories. We provided the government with an unmodified audit opinion on its 2021 consolidated financial statements. This clean opinion means that the information in the statements is reliable. The consolidated financial statements, which include the accounts of the government and its controlled entities, show that the government had a net debt of $1.3 billion as at March 31st, 2021. Net debt is a key financial indicator. This is the amount by which the government's liabilities exceeds its financial assets. Being in a net debt position means that the government will need to take action in the future to rebalance its finances. The government's acquisitions of tangible capital assets over time has contributed significantly to the growth of the net debt. In preparing financial statements, the government has to make estimates and assumptions that affect the amounts it reports. The government's significant areas of measurement uncertainty are disclosed in the notes to the financial statements. As these amounts are estimated, it's possible that an amount appearing in the government's financial statements could significantly change in future years. As a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, our auditors conducted the audit remotely again this year. Because of good relationships and communication with the government, departments, and agencies, public agencies, we were able to carry out sufficient and appropriate audit work to base our conclusions on. We expect to resume traveling to the territory to conduct our work in the future. I would like to thank the Comptroller General, the Deputy Minister of Finance, and the staff of the departments and public agencies who were involved in preparing the government's financial statements. Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening remarks, and we would be pleased to answer the committee's questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Miller. I will now open the floor to any questions from committee members. Beginning with MLA Cleveland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, my first question is in regards to timelines. And so I'm wondering if the Office of the Auditor General would, I guess, kind of entertain a bit of a conversation about when we are able to do the public accounts together. By our processes, we have the fall that we normally focus on our capital acquisition plan, and then we're approving budgets for the following fiscal year in February and March. And so we've now just passed our next fiscal budget, but we're having the opportunity to look at public accounts from the previous year. And we haven't had the opportunity to look at this before we go through our next budgeting cycle. And that's a concern because it doesn't allow us to really use our public accounts and apply them to our next budgeting cycle. And so I'm wondering if the OAG can speak to kind of the either importance of the timeliness of public accounts or what we can do as a committee in order to be able to review these accounts in a more timely fashion. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to whoever wants to take it.
It's Ms. Dar to respond. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, MLA Cleveland, for the question. We definitely agree that advancing the timeline of the completion of the public accounts would increase government transparency, increase accountability, and as we are hearing today, would make it more useful for this committee and other users of the financial statements. The challenge in its completion is it involves many areas that require timing and coordination and substantial resources to compile the information. It starts with the individual departments, which each have their own departmental directors and finance managers that submit budgets and financial information to the Office of the Comptroller General, where all this information is gathered and analyzed and compiled. It also involves the various components or the public agencies that are reporting separate financial statements and have their own external audits. Often some of those are completed by external CPA firms outside of the Office of the Auditor General of Canada's mandates. And finally, all of these entities could be included in the government reporting entity. So there's a consolidation process. We recognize that as the auditors, we have a role in this coordination as auditors of some of the components that are consolidated and also as the auditor of the government's consolidated financial statements. So scheduling and coordination among financial statement preparers and auditors are one of the more significant challenges to advancing the reporting timelines. However, in our discussions with committee already and with the Office of the Comptroller General, we're committed to relooking at timelines and having a plan to incrementally try and increase these timelines. At a minimum, we also think that in terms of preparing information for this committee for your use, advancing the discussions that we have and the timing of meetings such as today's can be advanced as early as for the next audit. So we're happy that you've raised this timeliness question for us, and we would like to work with you on that along with the officials at the GNWT. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ms. Starr. Yeah, at a very minimum, I think committee has agreed that we will review the public accounts earlier, so a bit of that responsibility lies on us in getting this scheduled, and then hopefully we can get all the other processes to happen a little earlier. I'll turn it over to you, MLA Cleveland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, just to follow, I guess, just to close that one then, is it the opinion of the Office of the Auditor General that there's potential for us to be able to review the public accounts from the previous year before we go through our next budgeting cycle? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Just for timelines, the budget cycle is February, March in session, and then but we're usually reviewing those in about January. Over to you, Ms. Starr.
Yes, I think it is reasonable and realistic. So what we would be working to do is as soon as the public accounts audit is completed and the public accounts have been tabled, what we would look to do is provide a session if committee would like to have that with us to do a bit of an overview, and then we would look to schedule a meeting such as today prior to that February timeline. So as early as, let's say, November, December, possibly into the January period.
Thank you. Any further questions from committee? MLA O'Reilly? Shall we go on a different topic?
We can tag team.
Okay, yep, thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think we've got a whole bunch of questions here, but I guess I want to start with disclosure in the financial statements around resource revenues. And it's kind of like a single line item. Well, it is a non-renewable resource revenue. The budgeted amount was $33 million. The actual was 66 and change. But there's, I know there in note 2P, there's some discussion of what the net fiscal benefit is, but this is actually a gross amount, as I understand it in this line. It's not even what G&WT actually gets to keep. There's in the financial statement discussion and analysis on page 37, there's a mention of a windfall around 42 point something million dollars for a work bid forfeiture. But, we've got a combined line item here that, as I understand it, includes mining royalties, oil and gas royalties, royalties that are received from the federal government for Norman Wells. It only took me about 5 emails back and forth with the ITI minister to actually understand what that line item means. There's quarrying fees and then water license, water use fees. So how does this compare to other jurisdictions in terms of transparency and the ability for the public and even us as MLAs to know what the resource revenues are to this government? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, MLA O'Reilly.
Mr. Hogg will go, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Hawk?
With respect to that line item, it's typically not a material line item, so that could explain why historically there hasn't been a breakout. It's definitely true that last year there was that large unusual item that really made the number spike. I think in cases like that, description in the financial statement, discussion and analysis is one good way to provide readers with some insight as to, well, what happened, why was this number larger than usual, why was it over budget? In terms of your desire to see more information, even though we might say it's not required for materiality reasons, if that's something that the committee would like to see, and that it's something that we could potentially talk about with the Comptroller General, because I don't think there would be anything against or anything wrong with providing additional disclosure, but I think it's something we'd want to work in concert with the Comptroller General to figure out what would make sense.
Thank you, Mr. Hawk. Emily O'Reilly?
Yeah, no, thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and I get that the materiality issue is, I think, your trigger's about $60 million or something, so that if anything's below that, then there's no requirement for that to be disclosed. But, our government pushed very hard to get devolution in April 1st of 2014. The government's position is that it wants to be a responsible resource manager. Well, I think the public deserves to know what the revenues are from resource development. And I'm not pinning this on you folks. You guys audit what you're given and look at how that's presented. So I'll be pursuing that with the Comptroller General as well. But but I am interested though in say how other jurisdictions do this. There's some international standards that have been developed around this. The Extractive Industry Sector Transparency Initiative. There's International Monetary Fund has developed some standards around disclosure of resource revenues. And I don't know, in your experience, maybe looking at Yukon, Nunavut, other jurisdictions, how do we compare in terms of our disclosure around resource revenues? Or is that something you can talk about today. Thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Miller?
So in terms of financial note disclosures, what we want to make sure is that they are consistent with the Canadian public sector accounting standards. So that's our first aspect that we'll go to. So we did mention materiality earlier in your question. Materiality, when we're looking at it, when we assess it, we consider qualitative factors and also quantitative factors. So the quantitative is one aspect, but we will also look at qualitative factors that would influence a user of the financial statements. So from that aspect, if it's important, if we feel it's information that would be important for the users, that's where we'll have the discussion with the Comptroller General to determine the level of disclosure that needs to take place in the financial statements. Now, in terms of benchmarking from other jurisdictions, right now I would have to go back and assess what others are doing at this point. I don't know if Ms. Dar, based on her prior experience with maybe another one, could comment at this point. Yeah? Okay.
Go ahead, Ms. Starr.
Thank you. I would say it's, the jurisdictions that I've looked at are very similar to where the GNWT currently is disclosing. However, there's, as Mr. Hogg explained, there is room for enhanced disclosure in a separate note in the financial statements to enhance a line item. You probably wouldn't want to introduce separate line items in the statement itself to enlarge it, but in a note disclosure, it provides you with that room to do that. And then the other area where you could have more discussion about analytical changes from a prior year result or maybe even a budget result, the financial statement discussion analysis portion of the public accounts is a good home for that discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Starr. Emily Cleveland?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I have a few questions in regards to kind of different themes on liabilities. My first one is in regards to contaminated sites. I understand that within our public accounts, there are liabilities associated with accepted contaminated sites, but not liabilities associated with contaminated sites that aren't yet accepted by the GNWT. And I'm wondering if this is a standard practice by other jurisdictions or how other jurisdictions capture that potential liability. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Starr?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the question. So yes, the content that is currently in the environmental liabilities note in the government's financial statements is in accordance with the public sector standard, which is 3260. So it follows the required disclosure, and that's for the sites for which the government has accepted responsibility. In terms of additional information of those other sites, they fall into the category of being a contingency. So they're disclosed generally to say that there could be other sites that are not included in the provision itself where an estimate has been given to the environmental liability. We have seen in other jurisdictions where further information is mapped out, perhaps in a graphic or in a sort of a list or a schedule of other sites where there could be contamination, where there could be a provision required in the future. And this information can be provided in other reports outside of the financial statements. And again, I think that that is work that the departments would need to do in concert with the GNWT officials. And we agree that this information would provide some more forward-looking information that is relevant to users and would be in addition to the, at a point in time, what is the liability that can be estimated.
Thank you, Ms. Starr. Emily Cleveland?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'm just thinking kind of in terms of the relationship between kind of the potential liability from contaminated sites where we kind of don't capture that altogether. But then as far as litigation and potential litigation, we do capture claims with undeterminable outcomes. And just from what I hear about the difference of costs of our current potential claims or through litigation versus our liabilities through contaminated sites, there's a lot more potential liability in contaminated sites. So I'm wondering why the different accounting structures for each of those. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Starr?
Yes, it's a very good point that in terms of the disclosure, the general disclosure that's included in the financial statements for outstanding claims and contingencies, there is a balance, an amount that is provided. Perhaps one of the reasons I can offer to that is in the schedule for claims and contingencies, there is a simpler process to be able to perhaps attach an amount next to individual cases. Quite often you'll have two parties, perhaps extra, involved in the claims that have been put forward. With environmental liabilities and with sites, inherently it's just subject to so many more additional inputs, making it more complex to estimate. There's valuation techniques, perhaps experts required to do each of those. So outside of the standard requiring that an amount be estimated and accrued or even compiled in the sense that you're asking about, it's more complicated. And at this point in time, I don't think it's normal practice to try to do that. Maybe for fear of being incomplete, maybe for fear of being under accruing information like that. So while I think the user's need and the desire for that is real, it may not be a practical situation to try and do from a financial standpoint.
Thank you, Ms. Starr. Yeah, and if I could just editorialize a little, I think it's very, very likely we will spend more than the $160 million remediating sites, and very unlikely we will spend the $125 million in settling claims. So I recognize there are different public accounting standards, but just from what we know of the amount of remediation work we have to do, and sites yet to be accepted, there's a lot more hiding there. But with that, I'll turn it over to MLA O'Reilly.
Thanks, Ms. Trey. That's quite the tag team we got going here. Well, yeah, maybe I'll just continue on with a question about the environmental liabilities that my colleague started. And, you know, our government has been in negotiation with the federal government as a result of the devolution agreement over a number of sites where we may end up accepting some liability and responsibility. And I'll just use one example, the Ptarmigan mine down the road, where GNWT had $0 in financial security for the surface lease covering the operation. And it's a total mess if you ever drive by. Our government's actually doing some work over the summer to provide for some type of stuff that you spray on the surface of the tailings to try to keep them from blowing around. But that's only a short-term solution that has to be applied almost annually. What we need is a real cover, gravel cover on top of the tailings, and consolidating them if possible. But in any event, we will assume additional liabilities, but the amount of information that's available to the public is really only what you see in the public accounts. There's no publicly accessible database, although I understand one is being developed, might be made available. I just compare that to what the Federal Treasury Board has put in place, a very transparent, publicly accessible database. You can see individual sites year by year, how much is spent, the stage at which remediation has been completed, outstanding work that's to be done, and so on. I think it's the gold standard in terms of what disclosure can and should look like. Our government still needs to do a lot better, but some of those sites that we're still negotiating will turn into liabilities, and I think there's probably ways to even start to consider those as contingent liabilities. We've got some very good modeling available to us. We've got lots of experience with contaminated sites here. What is it that you would recommend in terms of next steps in trying to provide for greater disclosure around in these areas? and moving towards starting to actually classify some of these sites as more than just we don't know at this point. Is there any advice or recommendations you'd like to give us? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, MLA O'Reilly. Ms. Starr?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the question. Yes, I think that the database that you spoke to, that the department and the government is working on putting together, will be a very good start for providing this information. Again, to reiterate, this would be outside of the financial statements because these are for potential sites for which a liability may be required in the future. So in terms of organization, there's a number of different ways to provide this information by location. Certainly could be very useful. We were talking about the graphics, maps with dots and things that would highlight for folks when they see the territory where the sites are located to give a bit of a visual. Comparing to the schedule that's currently in the financial statements for environmental liability sites that are recorded, they're provided in categories. So the type of site, whether it's a landfill, airport related items, sewage lagoons, fuel tanks, for example. So those would be sort of the categories I think that would be useful as well, with the number of sites, perhaps with information about years of age, and summarizing it in that way that would make it clear to readers that are interested in that information is a good start.
Thank you, Ms. Starr. MLA O'Reilly?
I'll turn to my colleagues. I've got lots more, but that's enough for now. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, MLA Cleveland.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I kind of alluded to my next one, which is the subject of litigation as one of our liabilities within the GNWT. And I know that we brought this up last year as well. So my understanding is that it's claims with undeterminable outcomes, so not necessarily money that the GNWT will pay out in full, but my concern is around transparency, and I understand that there are requirements for privacy within litigation, but as this number continues to climb within our public accounts, we don't necessarily have a transparent view, or does the public or necessarily other departments even, about what those trends, where those trends are coming from, whether it's human resources, land claims, whether it's stuff to do with contracts. And so I'm wondering kind of what the standard is or best practices are for transparent reporting of claims with undeterminable outcome as a liability. Thank you.
Thank you, MLA Cleveland. I will turn that over to Ms. Miller and let her decide.
Okay, so in terms of contingent liability claims, what I've seen in the past, maybe from a federal side, we have seen in terms of within what's audited, we would see the provisions for what is determined likely. There are other claims within the government of Canada that in some cases the amounts have not yet been assessed, but we know there are claims that have been done. That information is in other volumes from my understanding. But there is, that information is also available on certain websites from the departments of the types of claims that they've received and whether there's been aspects that there's more information that needs to be received to be able to make the assessments. In terms of where the information can come from, there could be categories, but the privacy of that information is very critical. What we've seen in notes to financial statements, sometimes we'll give a highlight that they're related to specific court cases, but not necessarily giving additional information, not to influence necessarily the outcomes of those court cases. So that's it. But I'm sure if the committee would want maybe more information in a more confidential manner, that information could be something that could be requested to the government.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. Yeah, I'm going to sneak in a question here. If you could also speak to whether that changes at all once it's become public information. There's a number of media stories about the class actions we have against the GNWT. I'm just assuming they are somewhat in there. There's a lot of media stories about Stanton P3 litigation that is ongoing, and some of those even come with the amounts that are being claimed. So I'm just wondering if the note or the information that could be included from a public accounting perspective changes at all once it is public information.
So your question, I think it could. I think it depends on the confidentiality agreements that have taken place as part of the settlement agreements between both parties. But I have seen from my experience, let's just say in certain notes to the financial statements, and I might give the Government of Canada as one of the examples where there was a subsequent event that took place in last year's financial statements in which there was a bit of information included in the note disclosure to explain the change that took place as a result of a decision that took place by the courts for one of the cases. So yes, there could be something that could be added there should the government feel it's possible to do so given the information that's being shared publicly.
Thank you. Emily Cleveland?
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And to be honest, my one of my biggest concerns is, while respecting confidentiality, I think it's important that the GNWT have the opportunity to look at lessons learned from existing potential liabilities in litigation. So whether that is, if it does come from lessons learned in HR, lessons learned in contract negotiations, or any of that, I think that taking advantage of those opportunities is important. But given our increase, I think the graph kind of goes like that. When you look at how claims with undeterminable outcome, what they look like for the GNWT over the last few years, they're substantially increasing. And so I'm wondering how our jurisdiction compares to other jurisdictions in regards to that change, or kind of any suggestions that were made by the OAG to the GNWT in regards to this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Cleveland. Ms. Miller?
Given the claims are undeterminable, there's usually some wording to explain that there could be other court cases, but they haven't not been yet assessed, or they're undeterminable at that point, and there will be information in the note disclosure related to that. But often the Canadian public sector accounting standards do not require more information. I think from a perspective of lessons learned, there could be something that could be done, but maybe outside of the financial statements necessarily. So maybe FSDA, the financial statement disclosure and analysis, could be an area that could be mentioned. But again, in terms of that, maybe from a committee, that could be a discussion with the government as well, if you desire to learn more about the lessons learned from an operational point of view.
Thank you. Emily O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I want to move over to kind of the capital or infrastructure side of the public accounts, and it's my understanding that about a little over 60% of the capital money that was budgeted in 2021 was actually lapsed, didn't get out the door, and that's a pretty significant amount. I think it's $287 million. Part of the problem, I guess, as legislators, we approve the capital estimates, but then we never find if anything ever gets lapsed or falls off the books, so to speak, doesn't get out the door. And the only time we kind of find out a little bit about that is when we start to dig into the next set of capital estimates and start to ask questions about the status of projects and so on. So I'm just wondering if you've dealt with any other jurisdictions that provide sort of in-year reporting or greater disclosure of lapsed funds when it comes to capital projects, which seems to be an increasing issue with regard to our government. I also know that, this is a snapshot in time. It happened during COVID. There's a good discussion around COVID and in the financial statement discussion and analysis stuff. But that just seems like an awful lot of money that we just couldn't get out the door. And as legislators, we approve a budget, but then we never find out what actually falls off the capital wagon, so to speak. So any ideas about how we can better manage this and make some of that information public and available to us, but also others? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily O'Reilly. Ms. Miller?
Thank you for the question. I'm not aware of other jurisdictions that do provide the in-year reporting that you're referring to, but I believe that may be a question that could be posed to the government, whether it's something that is possible to provide to the committee. In terms of your question to be able to get information on the capital and the lapsing, the FSDA, the Financial Statement Discussion and Analysis, would be the area that would be able to speak to why the amounts are being lapsed and the reasons. In terms from a financial statement note disclosure, you would be getting the consolidated budget amounts at what was expected to be expensed in the year or planned for in the year, and at the same time what actually took place. So that's my response, Mr. Chair. I don't know if anyone else would want to add on to this. Okay, go, Mr. Hawk, please.
Thank you, Mr. Hawk.
Thank you. Yeah, as Ms. Miller said, the financial statements do show what were the actual capital acquisitions in the year, and so that's very much our focus, is what did get spent, what got capitalized, and that's our number one priority. On the face of the statements, there is a high-level consolidated number that will show you what was the budget, and so that's really what the financial statements and the public sector accounting standards require. But within the financial statement discussion and analysis, there's really a lot of room for leeway in terms of the information you provide in there. Sometimes people focus more on the variance to prior year actuals, but you could also have discussion versus budget, some combination of the two. And so I think that could be one thing to consider, is what sort of focus does the government or the committee want to see in that financial statement discussion and analysis. But beyond that, because the numbers are so high level, I think more detailed granular information might have to come out of an internal budgeting process.
Thank you. Emily O'Reilly?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And yeah, I'll ask the same questions of the Comptroller General a little later today. I know that in the last public accounts, there was a management letter on the fiscal responsibility policy because the government actually was not in compliance with it in the last public accounts. This one, the analysis shows that, and it is disclosed that they are in compliance with the policy. But I think part of the issue is the way the objectives that are set in the policy are probably okay, but the ways of measuring how we actually achieve those just with a one-year snapshot might not be the best way to do it, because there's a lot of projects now that are kind of going outside of the scope of the policy. The P3s, the public-private partnerships, where we accrue debt over decades, are not considered in the fiscal responsibility policy. But given this lapsing of funding in the capital side and what that means in terms of not being able to spend maybe some of that money on programs and services, is there any sort of suggestions or guidance that you might offer us in what the fiscal responsibility policy might start to look like if we try to take a longer term view? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily O'Reilly. Ms. Miller?
Thank you for the question. So in terms from what I understand, P3s are not included in the fiscal responsibility policy is what I'm gathering from the question. I understand that P3s is a mechanism of financing projects. It's a budgeting tool to a certain extent of where you're getting your money. So in terms of what I've seen elsewhere, to my knowledge, I don't have that information right now, but I am committing to the committee to do a bit of research to see what other jurisdictions are doing right now. So I'll wait there and I'll provide the information to the committee, Mr. Chair, once I know more.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. Any further questions from committee? MLA Cleveland?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So we learned from within the public accounts that that a portion of the Financial Administration Act was not met from the Northwest Territories Health and Social Services Health Authority. And I'm wondering if the OAG can provide a little bit more information on what happened there and what the follow-up was with the GNWT. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Miller?
I'll turn it over to Ms. Starr for this portion. Oh, Mr. Hawk, sorry.
Mr. Ogg?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This stream of transactions that you're referring to took place at the Northwest Territories Health and Social Services Authority, and our colleagues that work on that audit, as part of the work they do each year, they audit transactions on a sample basis. They also examine processes to see how they work and check that the controls are working as designed. And it was during all of that work that they learned that this stream of medical travel was being processed at the authority, and there was a linkage from their system to the shared services at the government. And it's my understanding that there was a miscommunication there where both sides of the equation were not aware that certain approvals were not being done as they are required to be. Every payment has to be approved in accordance with the FAA, and so those approvals were not being done. This was caught. It was reported in the audit opinion for that particular entity, and it's my understanding that since that time a manual process has been put into place. During this year's audit, our team will follow up on their management letter recommendation on this point, and we'll be working with them to assess how the improvements have been made and if the end result is satisfactory.
Thank you, Mr. Hogg. MLA Cleveland?
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. So I'm just thinking, we're not the only jurisdiction that really heavily relies on medical travel, and so I'm wondering if the issue is a need for kind of a tweak to the FAA, or if and how our FAA compares to other jurisdictions that use medical travel. Because I'm thinking, if medical travel approvals have to go all the way up the chain, but there's something that happen on a regular basis, is it potentially that the FAA needs to change and it's not that we need to go all the way up the chain for those approvals? And I just want to better understand that. Thank you.
Thank you, MLA Cleveland. Mr. Hogg?
Thank you. In this case, I would say there would be no need to change the FAA. The way the Northwest Territories FAA works is very similar to what I've seen at the federal level and also in my previous work in the Yukon. I think the way it's designed is that any payment for any particular expenditure needs these required approvals. So in this case, it was about a process very specific to this type of transaction. And because it was spanning two organizations, there was this opportunity where there was a miscommunication. So in this case, it's a process fix and not something that would require a change to the FAA.
Thank you, Mr. Hogg. MLA Cleveland?
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I'm just in continuing with the NTHSSA. It's definitely an area of budgeting that is of huge concern for members. We have an incredibly growing deficit as far as healthcare in the territory goes. But at the same time, you can't say no to someone's health. And you need to properly budget for the health of our people. Without healthcare, healthcare is incredibly important, and we need to be able to properly fund that. And so I'm wondering if there are best practices from other jurisdictions as far as both budgeting for healthcare and the resources to support that were picked up as part of this process through the Office of the Auditor General, that are suggestions that could be made to the GNWT as far as being able to properly budget for our healthcare needs. Thank you.
Emily, thank you, Emily Cleveland. Ms. Miller?
Thank you for the question. So this would be probably good questions as part of a performance audit in terms of looking at the processes and in place, and also seeing how services are delivered. So this wasn't part of the scope of the work that was conducted, but this would be, I would propose that should the committee feel strongly about these subject matters, that these could be aspects that could be coming from a request from the committee for us to look at in the performance audit.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. Emily O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I want to continue with NTHSSA, Northwest Territories Health and Social Services Authority. So it's my understanding that they only submitted their final audit on November the 18th, which was months behind schedule. They actually asked for an extension. They didn't even meet the extension. I think, can you explain what that did to your budget or to your work, and whether it delayed your work or not? Because I think it probably delayed the overall reporting of the public accounts and review of them. But what's behind the delay there as well? And is it something that's an easy fix, or what's going on? So I'll start with that. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily O'Reilly. Ms. Miller?
Thank you for the question. So the root cause that was determined to be some of the reasons for the delay, I understand COVID-19 pandemic was one of them. And also I had understood that there was quite a large staff turnover within the organization, and therefore in terms of preparing the financial reporting for that, for the NTHSSA, delayed the work for our office to be able to complete it, and waited some time before there was staff that was able to come in and to be able to provide us the information we needed to complete the audit. Yes, that had an impact in terms of delaying the work for the public accounts for the consolidation process. And from my understanding of the engagement leader responsible for that audit, that there are resources that have now been assigned to this entity, and we are optimistic for this year's audit that the situation will be better than last year.
Thank you. Any further questions from the committee? Emily O'Reilly?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm hoping I can be optimistic as well, but I guess I'm somewhat frustrated as well because, you know, I was in the last assembly. There was the push for transformation of our healthcare system to actually merge the regional authorities together, and the idea was that there'd be a more coordinated approach to accounting, but also patient care and outcomes. And I just not sure we've actually got there. What I have seen is, you know, the deficit of the NTHSSA has grown 2.5 times since 2016. It's now $160 million. And I still don't have a good sense of what the waiting times are for different types of services and patient care. I continue to get complaints as an MLA about the wait times. We are having difficulty maintaining the services here in Yellowknife, let alone in the regions and at the community level. We're not in a good place. And I think part of that is a result of COVID, but I think that's also part of the way that healthcare seems to be going across Canada, but I believe in public healthcare, so don't anybody say that I want to privatize any of this. But it just seems to me we need to be spending more and smarter on healthcare. And we just don't budget enough for that initially. and I know in the past we would have these huge subs every year for health. They seem to have gone down a little bit, but what are the trends in other jurisdictions, and are they facing the same sort of pressures? And any suggestions for solutions? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Miller?
Thank you for the question. So in terms of your questions, again, not part of the scope of the audit work performed, we do have opportunities to speak with our counterparts in other jurisdictions throughout the year. This is a topic I could bring up, but I would also expect that even within the government level, from doing a benchmarking exercise, they could also probably provide more insight in terms of what's being done elsewhere.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. MLA Cleveland?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. While we're talking about healthcare, coming off of also a conversation on P3s, I'm wondering if the Office of the Auditor General can speak to the Stanton Legacy Building. There was a difference of opinion last year that we discussed with the Office of the Auditor General in regards to whether or not the Stanton Legacy Building was considered a P3 project. And I'm wondering if the Office of the Auditor General is still of the same opinion that they were last year. Thank you.
Respond.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So with respect to the Old Stanton Hospital Renewal Project, the balances related to that arrangement, as well as the contractual rights and obligations, those are all included in the consolidated statements and the notes to the statements. However, as you pointed out, the project itself is not explicitly disclosed as a P3. We first looked at this project in depth as part of our fiscal 2020 audit, and we concluded at that time that it was a P3 and should be disclosed as such. In 2020 and again in 2021, due primarily to the fact that all the balances and commitments are in the statements, we concluded that the financial statements were fairly stated with regards to this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Hogg. MLA Cleveland?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So we're in a situation where there's a discrepancy between the GNWT's opinion on this one and the Office of the Auditor General. And I'm wondering if the Office of the Auditor General can kind of speak to the potential impact of that difference of opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hogg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is an ongoing issue. We did look at it again in the fiscal 2021 audit, and I understand that management will be providing us with some additional analysis to support their view on this matter as part of the 2022 audit, and so we plan to take a look at that when it's available. We will be updating our analysis regardless to make sure that the balances continue to be either significant or material, and we'll have to take a look at that and see how it might impact our opinion at the end of the current year audit.
Thank you, Mr. Hogg. Further questions from the committee? MLA Cleveland?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just one more question. In regards to kind of the evolution of public accounts and how they're presented to both committee and the public today. I'm wondering what other jurisdictions are doing as far as digitizing or modernizing the presentation of their public accounts. So if the Office of the Auditor General can speak to what kind of changes are happening in that respect and what the benefits of those are. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Miller?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I think from different jurisdictions are looking at how to make the information clearer for the users of the financial statements and the financial statements discussion and analysis. What I've seen in the past is the use of more graphics. I've seen also the accessibility of the information also being available in various forms to for different audiences that would be interested in reviewing the information. The transparency of the information is also important in terms of ensuring to give some of the key information that's coming out in the FSDA of what's taken place in terms of activities over the years from different governments. What else can I refer to? But from you mentioned digitizing, digitizing can mean different things. It can mean different technologies, different systems, different processes, but you also need the people who are also interested in changing and doing things differently. And from that perspective, I would say we're seeing different things taking place across the different jurisdictions. But I know for the government of the Northwest Territories, one of the changes that we've seen is in terms of adding in the consolidated budget in the financial statements and the statement of financial position, if I'm not mistaken, as part of that. And I can maybe ask either to Ms. Dar or Mr. Hogg. In the FSDA, I believe there's a bit more information as well that's been added, but I'm sure this is a great question for the comptroller to respond also in terms of improvements from the prior year.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. I'll ask Ms. Stark.
Thank you. Maybe the only thing I'll add about digitization, Ms. Miller is right, it means different things to different people. But I think for most of us now, technology is just the way that we carry on our daily lives. So although I have paper in front of me today, there's a lot of folks that are probably getting information from a phone or a screen in front of them. So some of that digitization will be thinking through about how that information comes through those screens to the ultimate end user, and is it readable? Can you scroll through and get to the information that you're looking for with the hyperlinks and the search functions working in a way that is most usable? So that's how I think about digitization. And I know in our office, when we talk to our communications and editorial teams, those are the kind of questions they're thinking about in terms of modernizing how we communicate to our end users.
Yeah, thank you. Well, and I think from committee's perspective, it's our ability to take the budget, the public accounts, and the non-consolidated statements and use them all together. And you know, sometimes the line items are different when you consolidate, obviously, and the budget line items often are changing their classification. So it's, you know, there's no ability to say how much are we spending on housing or health or something, because they go across departments and multiple line items. So that is a conversation we are actively having with our Department of Finance. Any further questions from committee? Emily Cleveland.
Promise. In one of our previous reports that we tabled in the House in regards to information and privacy, committee made a recommendation in regards to proactive disclosure. And so I'm wondering if, when reviewing public accounts, if there are opportunities for the Office of the Auditor General to make comments about transparency to the public accounts that they're reviewing. So maybe the public accounts follow all kind of prescribed accounting standards, but maybe there's opportunities to be more proactively transparent in some areas. And I'm wondering if that is kind of a piece or a lens that the Office of the Auditor General applies to their work. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Cleveland. Ms. Miller?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So in terms of proactive disclosure, when we're conducting our work for the audited financial statements, our lens is to look at, as legislative auditors, to see whether the financial statements comply with Canadian Canadian public sector accounting standards. And also we'll be looking to see if the transactions that come to our notice have been in compliance with laws and regulations that are applicable. In terms of proactive disclosure, again, we won't have necessarily that lens to look at in the financial statements and the note disclosures. What we would recommend, should the committee be interested for additional information, the FSDA, the financial statement discussion and analysis, could be something of consideration, When we do a review of that document, we review to make sure the information is not inconsistent with what we see in the financial statements. But should there be a desire to state aspects on that matter from a information privacy, proactive disclosure, that is an aspect that can be looked at, but it's not within the scope of our work to comment on.
Thank you. Any further questions from the committee? Okay, I wanted to sneak a couple in. My questions are in regards to kind of how public accounting standards treat assets. Specifically, I'm looking at Schedule A, tangible capital assets. That number continues to grow for the GNWT in this public accounts. It's $3.67 billion of tangible capital assets we have. And I get if you're a private company, you have assets and you could, in theory, sell them. But when I look at something like a road or a bridge, it's in no way an asset really to us. We're not going to sell it, and in fact, it's a bit of a liability that comes with a lot of ongoing maintenance. And I look at that 3.67 billion as a really a replacement cost that we in no way can afford. And I think this is probably most relevant or really highlighted with something like the Power Corp, where all of their assets, or the vast majority of their assets, have long since amortized. They're in that replacement phase. And if you tried to sell them or give them a book value for a hydro project that needs billions of dollars to be fixed, it's essentially a liability. And I know the GNWT has a huge deferred maintenance backlog. We can't keep up with the pace and costs to fix our infrastructure. There's also the new public accounting standard has somewhat done this with asset retirement obligations, but that figure comes nowhere close to the what I view as a liability, not a positive. It's not in the black there. But I'm wondering if anyone can give me whether there's a way to reflect this, or whether there's a conversation happening in public accounting standards that perhaps having an excess of roads that need replacement very soon needs to be reflected somewhere, as opposed to just being amortized as if we have that money at the end of the day. So any thoughts on that would be welcome. Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your question. I'll ask Ms. Dar to respond.
Ms. Dar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a big question. There's lots of elements to it, and I think you've spoken to some of them. Maybe I'll start with the accounting and then go a little more broad. So in terms of accrual accounting, that's what the government applies to their financial statements. So at a point in time, it is appropriate that these deferred or future maintenance costs or replacement costs, lots of different ways to describe them, they're not liabilities at this point in time. They would not meet the threshold to record as a provision as at a specific year end. These are future expenditures that you're very right to say is an obligation that the government will need to have a plan on how to address when the assets come to the end of their life and they're still needed to provide the services that they're designed for. So we see this as more of a budgeting matter. It really should be monitored as part of asset management plans, as part of capital plans. So to the effect in terms of standards, we're not aware of a current project in PSAS that would address that question. You're right about AROs, sort of creating a bit of a lens for people to start looking at the assets that they do currently have on their books and that they are using. It's drawing attention to the state of the tangible capital assets. And I think one of the things that people will be looking at is their net book values, especially the ones that as you've highlighted, that are currently at zero, but which ironically are still being used. So it's asking the accounting question is, well, have they been amortized too quickly? Have we assessed, back in the day when we built the building or the road, that it was going to last X number of years, which seemed like a long time, but time has passed and we've gotten to the end and we're still using the road because we've done a good job of maintaining and perhaps have invested in repairs and maintenance costs over the years to enable it to continue to be a usable capital asset. So from an accounting standpoint, as auditors, we're going to be talking to all our entities and perhaps asking them to reassess some of the estimated useful lives that they're using. So that will have a direct accounting impact because it'll change the amortization expense that will be expensed every single year, which impacts the bottom line in terms of the annual surplus or the deficit. So there's a way to relook at that. But your overall question, if I can go back to in terms of the huge replacement costs that will be required for heavy TCA entities, is going to be, I think, a budgeting question for those capital plans.
Agreed. Just always like to raise that issue. Any further questions from committee? On behalf of committee, we would like to thank you for presenting to you today and all of the work that you do. It is greatly appreciated, and we look forward to further conversations. Perhaps I will take a 5-minute break just to allow the Comptroller General to get set up. Good afternoon, everyone. I will call the meeting back to order. My name is Rylund Johnson, MLA for Yellowknife North, and Chair of the Standing Committee on Government Operations. We will now proceed with a presentation from the Office of the Comptroller General. We are joined here by Comptroller General, just Ms. Julie Moichin, and Assistant Comptroller General, Mr. Celestina O. I will now turn it over to you to give your presentation, and then we'll have questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, and thank you for inviting us before committee to discuss the 2021 Consolidated Public Accounts of the Government of the Northwest Territories. As you mentioned, with me today from the Department of Finance is Mr. Celestino O, and he's the Assistant Comptroller General. The public accounts is a key accounting and transparency reporting mechanism of the GNWT and presents the financial position and results of operations of the consolidated government reporting entity for the fiscal year. The public accounts report on what has already happened. The public accounts for 2020-2021 cover April 1, 2020 to March 31, 2021. As the public accounts can be very technical, the Department of Finance published a refreshed format of the financial highlights document that provides readers a summarized version of the public accounts as well as more explanatory information. The consolidated public accounts are audited by the Office of the Auditor General of Canada. The auditor's report again this year provides a clean opinion, which means readers can rely on the accuracy and reliability of this reporting. In terms of the financial highlights, the 2021 Consolidated Public Accounts reports that revenues were $2.44 billion and expenses were $2.35 billion, which resulted in an operating surplus of $90 million. During the year, the GNWT invested $270 million into capital infrastructure, and the consolidated cash position increased by $30 million. Overall borrowing, as defined by the NWT Borrowing Act, was $1.19 billion, which resulted in the government's residual borrowing capacity being $610 million at March 31, 2021. The public health emergency declared by the government in response to the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the government's fiscal results for the year ended March 31, 2021, which was the first full year of reporting since the public health emergency was declared. Given the materiality of this event, a separate note was included in the public accounts. In 2020-2021, there were revenues of $123 million and expenditures of $149 million related to COVID-19 impacts. These include increased costs for health and safety measures taken and expenditures for economic recovery in the form of financial support programs, as well as increased transfer payments from the Government of Canada. I want to thank the finance teams from every GNWT department and agency for their contributions to the on-time completion of these financial statements and for their extra efforts as they continue to work through new and different challenges. And that concludes my opening remarks.
Thank you very much. I understand you have a presentation today. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So on to slide 2, that's just an overview of what I'd like to walk through today. Starting with the financial highlights, then we'll walk through each of the consolidated financial statements, quickly talk about 2 future accounting standards, and an update on reporting. Next slide, please. So the GNWT public accounts includes 4 sections, and section 1 will be the focus of today's presentation. It is the consolidated position of the GNWT, which includes GNWT departments, public agencies, boards, and other entities. And there are 4 financial statements that we're going to review after a quick look at the financial highlights on the next slide. Next slide, please. So financial highlights. This slide lists the key financial highlights, which we will see in the future slides on the respective financial statements. Overall, in 2021, compared to 2020 actuals, we see increases in revenues and higher expenditures. We also see an annual surplus. There was an increase in financial assets and an increase in liabilities, as well as an increase in net debt of $27 million. And non-financial assets increased primarily as a result of capital projects. Next slide, please. The Consolidated Statement of Financial Position is the overarching statement that summarizes all entities' financial position at a point in time. So it's broken down into financial assets, which are used to pay liabilities, and the balance at year-end was $657 million. The largest change was the sinking fund, which was established to retire a portion of the liability for the Toledo All-Season Road in November of 2021. The second largest change was an increase in cash of 30 million. Liabilities are 2 billion and are existing obligations that are based on past transactions. The largest change included the 180 long-term debt that partially offsets some of our short-term borrowing, and then you see an increase in the P3 liability, primarily as a result of the work on Taser. Another notable increase is deferred revenue. The difference between financial assets and liabilities gives us net debt, which increased by $27 million. Under the net debt line are the non-financial assets. These are not used to settle liabilities, rather they are used to provide future services to the public. And these consist primarily of tangible capital assets such as schools, hospitals, and roads, etc. In 2021, a total of $270 million was spent on acquisition of assets. The large expenditures include $91 million for Taser, $7.2 million for the refurbishment of the Stanton Legacy building, and other projects such as roads, bridges, community health center, and equipment. Next slide, please. The consolidated statement of operations and accumulated surplus explains the overall change in financial position, and you'll note that on this slide the budget is included. This helps a reader compare what was planned versus the actuals for that year, and is further able to compare that with the prior year actuals. The budget and the financial statements must match the main estimates, which is required under public sector accounting standards, which means that when we have supplementary appropriations that are included in our revised estimates, those are not reflected here. That being said, we report revised estimates in our financial highlights as that have been re-signed in 2021 in the hopes of providing that comparison for readers of the statements, even though it cannot be provided in the statement itself. Additionally, the schedules in the non-consolidated financial statements provide more detail on GNWT departments and how their actuals compare to their revised estimates, and that's in Schedule 2. Now on to the numbers. In 2021, we saw higher revenues compared with 2020, which was made up of a higher grant from Canada, but also higher transfer payments from Canada, largely due to COVID-19 related expenditures and programs. As well as there was an increase in resource revenues. Likewise, expenses grew from 2020, largely due to the impact of COVID-19 for economic support programs and the implementation of health and safety measures. And in 2021, we had an overall surplus of 90 million. Next slide, please. The consolidated statement of net debt provides a reconciliation of how the net debt changed from the prior year. In 2021, the net debt did increase, but it increased less than the prior year as a result of there being an annual surplus in 2021 and a deficit in the prior year. And overall, the change in net debt was negative 27 million, increasing the balance to 1.34 billion at the end of 2021. Next slide, please. Lastly is the consolidated statement of cash flow. It is broken down into 4 sections. Operating transactions such as revenue and operating expenses resulted in a positive cash flow of 261 million. Investing transactions such as portfolio investments for MLA pension, the Heritage Fund, and the Sinking Fund for Taser resulted in a cash outflow of 55 million. The acquisition of tangible capital assets resulted in a cash outflow of 192 million. And finally, financing transactions such as short-term loans, acquisition and payment of long-term debt, and repayment of P3s resulted in a cash inflow of 17 million. So in total, the change in cash was an increase of 30 million. Next slide, please. A new note added into the financial statements in 2021 was specifically to disclose revenues and expenses related to COVID-19. Revenues related to the pandemic were 123 million and expenses were 149 million, resulting in a difference of 25 million. Next slide, please. The public accounts also includes a breakdown of the fiscal responsibility policy calculations for the debt servicing payments and infrastructure financing under the financial statement discussion and analysis section, which is shown above. In 2021, the GNWT is in compliance with the policy for both of these calculations. Debt servicing requirements were 1.56%, which is under the 5% maximum, and the FRP required 49 million cash surplus from operations to finance infrastructure, and the actual result was more than required at 139 million. The calculations in the FRP are based on the non-consolidated position of the GNWT, which means that it excludes all boards and agencies. Next slide, please. So just quickly, a bit of a recap from last year about 2 new accounting standards. One, asset retirement obligations, which I know you're familiar with, as we included this in the budgeting process. This was effective starting April 1, 2022. So you will see this included in the 22-23 public accounts. And the P3 standard, which will not have a large impact on the financial statements, as we've been following the early drafts of the standard, and is effective April 1, 2023. We will continue to update committee as new standards come into force that may have a significant impact on the GWT or that committee has expressed an interest in. And also, we include in the notes to the financial statements information on future standard changes as well. And finally, the next slide. The reporting unit within the Department of Finance has been working steadily towards continuous improvement on the public accounts. In 2021, we redesigned the financial highlights to provide information in a format easier to understand and with more details on variances. In 2021, we also made a number of changes to our FSD&A. For 2022, we are looking to adopt the new look and feel from our financial highlights to the FSD&A section of the public accounts, along with improvements to variance reporting and where feasible in our note disclosures. The Department of Finance remains committed to working on future enhancements to the public accounts and recommendations from committee. And Mr. Chair, that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Morchin. I will now open up the floor to questions from committee, beginning with Emily Cleveland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'm going to start with some specifics about the public accounts. And so a number of revenue line items were lower than originally budgeted for, specifically transfer payments, corporate income tax, mineral oil and gas royalties, and the revolving funds net revenue as well. And I'm wondering if the Office of the Comptroller General can speak to why these line items were much lower or significantly lower than budgeted. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Cleveland. Ms. Morchin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, there are at times corporate and personal income taxes can be quite volatile because we do start with estimates and then we receive the actual numbers from Canada. And also there can be times where there can be adjustments to prior year statements which will impact future year actuals. So sometimes that is why there can be significant changes between budget and actual specifically for those items. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily Cleveland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So were this public accounts differences in line with the differences from previous years? So I'm wondering if last year's were significantly higher than previous years or if the Comptroller General can speak to that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And just for some context, on page 20 of the non-consolidated, it shows that excess income tax advance this year was 133 million, and the year previous was 129 million. And I think similarly for corporate income tax, we for years and years have been wildly off on the projections. So if the Comptroller General could give us some insight in perhaps work being done to adjust those. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a great question, and it may be something I need to take back with me to the department. I'm certainly happy to provide, some information on how budget has compared to actuals over the last, say, five or so years, if that's helpful for committee. I do, recognize, and we also mentioned it in the public accounts, that there is some volatility there, and certainly why, although we do our very best, especially, during the year when there are fiscal updates, when new information becomes available from Canada, we update those future projections, including our cash forecasts as well, just with the most recent forecast and what we're expecting to receive. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Emily Cleveland.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And that brings me to my next question. So there is some forecasting happening then with the Government of Canada as far as taking actuals and forecasting for future accuracy of future budgets. And I'm wondering if that happens with all of the budgets, including from departments as well, or maybe the Comptroller General can speak to how actuals are used to forecast the rest of the budgets for main estimates for the GNWT. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Morchin.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. I can definitely speak to like when it comes to looking at future fiscal policy decision, absolutely the public accounts form a large role in that. In terms of past spending decisions will affect future spending decisions. So example, looking at the borrowing plan, looking at the borrowing limit, and looking at where our cash balances we ended with in the year and what we had to borrow and what we're projecting going forward will definitely have an impact on future budgets. Specifically how, the budgeting and revised forecasting process, that's a bit outside of what, I can speak to, but I do know that the public accounts form a large part of the discussion about future spending decisions and formulating that fiscal framework. So, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Emily Cleveland?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I'm happy that we're kind of leading into this next discussion because I think it's a concerning but an important one in regards to conversations with the federal government. The projection is that early in the next assembly that the GNWT may again hit its borrowing limit or its debt limit. And so I'm wondering if the GNWT is in conversations right now to seek an increase to the debt limit and what that conversation, what the impacts of that conversation are with the federal government and how they're receiving that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Moichin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That particular question is a bit outside what I'm able to speak to today, but certainly happy to bring that question back to the department to provide an answer to committee with an update. Thank you.
Yes, and I assure you we will be talking to the Minister of Finance about that. Emily O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, the first topic I mentioned to our friends with the Auditor General was the disclosure that is taking place with regard to non-renewable resource revenues. And in the consolidated statements, it's a single line item. And, it's taken me a series of emails with the ITI minister to actually understand what the breakdown of that is and what it really means. And as I understand it, it includes mining royalties, oil and gas royalties, water use fees, and quarrying fees, maybe some other kinds of fees. The Indigenous governments, we collect it. The Indigenous governments get a part right off the top with regard to what's in their land rights agreements. Then we also get some Norman Wells royalties, and then there's a formula in the devolution agreement about how that amount is to be split. But anyways, I just don't think that it's very transparent. What people are seeing is a gross amount, and it's not even clear what it consists of. And then there's an explanation buried in note 2P about what the net fiscal benefit generally is, but there's no actual calculation of what that is, and nobody really knows what the residual amount is that we get to keep, and how much even goes to the Heritage Fund. So can we not do better than what's in here, given our government's emphasis on resource development? I really think that we need to do a lot better with disclosure of these amounts and the calculation and how much our government actually gets to keep at the end of the day. So what is the Comptroller General, how far can we go with this? Because I just don't find this really very satisfactory. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily O'Reilly. Ms. Moichin?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the question. And actually, based on past comments we've heard from committee, it's something that my team and I have been looking at, so currently in the process of doing the 2022 public accounts, and we're looking to include more disclosure in the FSD&A section specifically. On the net fiscal benefit, because while we appreciate that there is a explanation of what makes up the fiscal benefit, it would be more transparent if we included the figures that go with that, and so we're looking to include more disclosure for the 2022 accounts. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Emily O'Reilly?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I'll be looking for that very carefully There's a $45 million or $42.7 million windfall amount in 2021. And the only way I could dig that out was through questions on the floor when it came to the actual budget. I know it's disclosed in the financial statement discussion and analysis, but I just think that we need to do a lot better in telling our residents what we're actually getting. But I want to move on to maybe another area, if I could, Mr. Chair, and that's the area of our capital expenditures and how much was lapsed in 2021. It's my understanding that about 60% of the capital, the amount that was budgeted for capital, was actually lapsed. And, as legislators, we approve, well, I voted against the capital budget, but that's a different thing. But we approve a lot of money for capital, and we're not able to get it out the door. I think part of the explanation may be COVID, but we approve a bunch of projects and expenditures, and then the stuff lapses during the course of the year, and we never find out about it. Is there not some way in which MLAs can actually find out about what is being lapsed and in which projects? And is there some way for the public to find that out as well, with some kind of in-year reporting or disclosure in the FSDA or something about what projects were actually lapsed? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily O'Reilly. Ms. Moichin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the question. And in the non-consolidated accounts on Schedule 4, we do provide by department that, variance in numbers, but not with commentary. So it is something that I'll take back as a commitment to look at what, if there's any possibility, including additional commentary specifically in the accounts for which I'm responsible for, and also bring back to department the wish of committee and what potential there may be for in-year reporting. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and if I could just editorialize a little, it's difficult for us to even talk about whether we're, running a surplus or a deficit or how we're doing in our budgeting when every year there's, 60% of the capital budget just doesn't get spent. It's such a large figure that influences everything else on how we look at our budgeting. So, and I do agree there is some good explanation, but there's certainly a bit more warranted because it's not as if we ran a great surplus. We just didn't get the money out the door, which is a conversation to have with infrastructure, obviously. But with that, I will turn it over to Emily Cleveland.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And in carrying with that, and I understand that there's a huge political conversation in here too that we can't really dive in here without the minister present. But from more of a financial standpoint, I'd love if the Comptroller General could walk us through kind of the financial impacts of approving budgets for projects that in turn doesn't get spent. And for example, if we are approving a $450 million capital budget, and if a large portion of that is debt dollars or borrowed dollars, what kind of an impact does that have on the GNWT as far as cost of not spending that money, or cost incurred by not spending that money, or cost incurred by any kind of holding on to any debt, or how does that even impact other spending by the GNWT that's not capital spending? Thank you.
Thank you, Emily Cleveland. Ms. Moichin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So when we borrow short-term debt, we use cash forecasting to determine the amounts, and that would be based on expected revenues coming in the door and when we expect cash outflows to happen, such as payroll, contribution agreements, but also capital projects, as you've referred to. And we do know that these fluctuate a bit throughout the year. But when the timing of those cash flows change, it can and will impact what we need to borrow. Or what we have already borrowed in anticipation of the cash needs of government. So it certainly does impact from that perspective. We do update our assumptions throughout the year based on the timing of these, where there may be timing changes. So we do our best to incorporate those. But to your point about the budget, I mean, again, that is more of a budgeting question, but certainly when we're looking at our future policy discussions, our fiscal framework, looking at future spending decisions, and looking at the borrowing limit, it certainly would take into account the capital expenditures projected, and so it would impact that availability on the borrowing plan. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Emily Cleveland?
Yeah, I have a few other questions that lead from this one, but just as a quick aside, I'm wondering if the Office of the Comptroller General looks at trends for or categorizes why projects are not happening that are budgeted for. Because this is, you know, I know that the COVID was mentioned, but carryovers is something that has happened long before COVID was here, as our lapses. And so I'm wondering if trends in that are something that are tracked by the Comptroller General and can easily be shared with committee and or even here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Morchin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No, that's not something that falls within my purview. It would, you know, likely be a discussion through the capital budgeting process and through the review of capital carryovers. Thank you.
Thank you. Emily Cleveland?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just while we're on the subject of interest and debt and kind of the fiscal realities right now in the world today, I'm wondering if the department has looked at costing out the impact of higher interest rates on our debt repayments and what the impact of that is. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Morchin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, that is something that we are looking at. As we know, interest rates have increased. So that is increasing the cost for us to borrow. Of course, our long-term debt issuance is at a fixed rate, so that won't change, but certainly the impact on our short-term debt is something that we are carefully looking at, and it does have an impact. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Emily Cleveland?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the caveats of the fiscal responsibility policy is that our debt servicing payments, they have a benchmark of not going above that 5% of revenue level, and I'm wondering what the risk is of that happening in the near future with our debt servicing. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Morchin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Based on conversations I have had internally, there's, you know, my understanding is there's not a risk of going above that 5%. But certainly as discussions on the fiscal responsibility policy are ongoing and actively looking at the policy, you know, those are things that they're taking into consideration as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'll go to Emily O'Reilly.
Thanks. Well, I want to thank my colleague for opening the fiscal responsibility policy can of worms. But in the last public accounts, we were not in compliance with the policy. There was no consequences as far as I could tell, except that the minister did make a commitment to review the policy. And I don't think that's your responsibility. But I guess I want to know kind of where that work is at and when and if it's going to come to us. And whether the new policy is going to take better account of P3 incurred debt. You know, as I understand it, the fiscal responsibility policy is basically a snapshot in time, 1 year. You know, how are the debt service payments being done for the 1 year, and did we actually generate enough surplus by not spending on programs and services to spend money on enough money, or maybe too much money sometimes on infrastructure, or budgeting too much money. But so is the new policy going to consider how to incorporate a longer term view to debt and debt servicing that's incurred through P3s in particular, but what's the new policy going to look like and when are we going to see it? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily O'Reilly. Ms. Morchin?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. As mentioned, the review of this policy does sit outside of my purview. However, speaking with my colleagues, they are actively working on this policy. They're looking and analyzing this policy, and they're expecting the outcome of that work to be completed this summer. As far as next step go with that, something I have to bring back to the department. But just in terms of the fiscal responsibility policy as a whole, while it is a snapshot in time, it is meant to inform our future policy decisions on, fiscal decisions. So, but that being said, I will bring back that comment from committee in terms of the longer term view and whether, the folks looking at this policy can have a look at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Emily O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and I appreciate it's not within the Comptroller General's purview, but yeah. I want to move on to, I guess, the Northwest Territories Health and Social Services Authority, and the Auditor General identified the medical travel authorization processes not being in compliance with the Financial Administration Act. So maybe could we just get your explanation as to what happened and how that's been corrected moving forward? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Marchand?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, the matter has been addressed, and it's been addressed through a manual process at this point, with the look to see how we might be able to make that more efficient, obviously using technology. But basically, my understanding is that a standalone system that the medical travel expenses flow through, it was that interface between that system and the financial system that was lacking the required approvals. That has been corrected, and we'll be looking forward to following up with NTHSSA on how we might be able to assist with streamlining any efforts in that area. Thank you.
Thank you. Emily O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So, I don't know, maybe you could just explain it, like, I know nothing. Okay, I've seen people get medical travel assistance. They fill out forms, and it goes off somewhere for somebody to approve it. Was the issue then that whoever was approving it didn't have the authority to approve the claimed amounts, or did it need to go to a third party or something within NTHSSA to provide some oversight, or what? I'm just trying to understand what the issue was. Thanks, and if it can be explained in plain, sort of so I can understand it, that would be great. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily O'Reilly. Ms. Marchand?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the standalone system with NTHSSA processes the medical travel bills, as I understand it. And really what happened is it's not directly linked into the financial system. So for example, if we were to process an account, like an invoice through the system, it would flow through an online approval process, an expenditure authority, and then it would flow to an accounting authority, and then it would get paid. In this case, it was an interface to the financial system, and that approval step between those two systems was not occurring. And so now it's occurring manually, but in the hopes that we can somehow make it electronic, which, as you had mentioned earlier, would reduce, time and effort. But that's, and if I'll just turn to Celestino and see if there's anything further to add to that, but that's sufficient.
Bureau?
So that's exactly what the issue was, is relating to the Financial Administration Act requires that there be evidence of both expenditure authority and accounting authority. In this case, the way the system was working was that there were reviews being done, but not necessarily, the evidence wasn't necessarily presented to the auditors in a systematic way, which we normally have with the system that the GNWT runs. Although there were reviews and whatnot happening on the expenditure side, it wasn't being done in the same manner that our GNWT system handles it. And then when you ask for samples, it is difficult to go back and then find that expenditure authority or approval authority. There were instances, I believe, that were also, because we cannot go, it was difficult to go back and demonstrate that. The conclusion was that it did not happen, and as a result, we say, okay, then that is against FAA. So the manual system that has been put in place is to make sure that, minus the integration of the systems, that the expenditure authority and the accounting authority are evidenced clearly, and so that when the auditors ask for it in the future, we can show them that this is who approved it, who reviewed it, and so forth, in a very systematic, consistent manner, and that's what the manual system now puts in place.
Thank you, Mr. Rowe. Mr. O'Reilly?
Yeah, no, thanks for that explanation. I just don't want anybody then to go away with the impression that people got money they weren't supposed to be getting, or that somebody wasn't doing their job. It just sounds like the ability to demonstrate the oversight wasn't being registered in a systematic fashion. So I understand that now, and I just don't want anybody to go away with the impression that things were being done off the books or whatever. So, okay, that's great. Let's then, I just want to move on then to the overall issue of NTHSSA deficits, which have grown 2.5 times since 2016. It's now $160 million. And, you know, what are we doing to, you know, there's some kind of sustainability office that's now been set up within NTHSSA. There's supposed to be 4 positions. I think only 1 has been filled. I don't think there's a publicly available plan for how sustainability is going to be addressed. What is it that you folks are doing to try to encourage, and NTHSSA delivered their audited statements late, which delayed the consolidation and the Auditor General's work. There just seems like there's a lot of things that need to be fixed at NTHSSA from an accounting perspective to get us where we can and should have been as a result of transformation. So what is it that you guys are doing to help them improve? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Moitchin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, so my understanding is that the NTHSSA has increased their financial reporting capacity, which is going to assist with that on-time completion of their financial statements. My office, we continue to work with the finance team at NTHSSA. You know, and NTHSSA in their annual report, which is included in the public accounts, also mention a number of measures that they're looking to take as well. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Emily O'Reilly?
I think we'll stop there. I'll let my colleagues take over for a while. Thanks.
Emily Cleveland?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I guess further to that line of questioning in regards to NTHSSA from my colleague, and what we heard in the part of this meeting with the OAG was that one of, in regards to timely reporting, NTHSSA was quite delayed in their reporting. And so I'm wondering if the Comptroller General can speak to the processes and resources that NTHSSA either has or needs in order to be able to meet the deadlines of this process. Thank you. Thank you.
Ms. Moitchin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, as I mentioned before, the NTHSSA has increased their financial reporting capacity. We continue to have lots of open dialogues with the finance team, and we also feel confident that they'll be able to meet their reporting deadlines this year. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Emily Cleveland?
And I guess I wanted to just put a comment in here. And it's not just about being able to kind of nicely close things off. I think that there are some really useful ways that we can use the information from public accounts when we're going through the main estimates process. And so I think being able to have the view of how money was actually spent is really important to the processes on this side of the house. And I know even just from being able to speak to different NGOs, people in communities, a lot of the things that we're being asked for in order to put money into, and that we use our negotiating powers to put money into, then we find through public accounts that they were undersubscribed. And so I think there's other questions that need to be asked there, but that can't be asked without us seeing the actuals. And, you know, whether that's, is it a policy keeping people from accessing a funding pot? Is it communication? And us being able to kind of see both sides of it is so important. So more of just a comment on that one. From the next one that I wanted to kind of jump into was the conversation about litigation that we had with the Office of the Auditor General. And so one of the things that we had asked for last year was information on trends, and then also a better understanding of how lessons learned come out of the GNWT and go to departments in order to mitigate the increasing potential liabilities from claims. And so I'm wondering if the Comptroller General can kind of speak to any work being done within that, or both in terms of transparency and in lessons learned. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Moichin?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. As a result of committee's recommendation to look at this note disclosure, based on last year's review, the team has taken that away. They've looked at some jurisdictional information in addition to that provided by committee to see what is possible. And so while always, being careful around any privacy, confidentiality concerns and disclosing information, of course, we're looking to see how we might be able to make that information, add more detail to that information that we disclose. Bearing in mind that these are amounts that are not determinable, bearing in mind that these are the amounts, this is the worst case scenario, if you will, because this is the amount of the claim, and that, disclosing information in a way that might interfere with any type of work in that area. But that being said, we do take it very seriously to look at how we might be more transparent on this note disclosure, and we're actively working on that right now with the hopes of being able to, that work, concluding before the end of the 2022 public accounts. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Emily Cleveland?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I kind of jumped ahead of myself there and didn't actually ask a question for commitment in that previous comment that I made. I wanted to just go back to the conversation on timelines, and we had informed the Office of the Auditor General that on our side of the house, we start looking at the budgets for the February-March sitting throughout the month of January and spend a lot of time going through those with departments. And so I'm wondering if, from the view of the Comptroller General, if there is room to make a shift for committee to be able to see the public accounts of the previous year before committee goes through, or before regular members go through that process of reviewing main estimates in January. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Moichin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A commitment made a number of years ago by the Office of the Comptroller General was to provide the non-consolidated public accounts before the statutory reporting requirement, so a month earlier. And the point of that was to assist in committee's review of the business plans. And then in the main estimates, of course, there is a column for actuals that come from the public accounts. But that being said, we have the same view as the Office of the Auditor General in that we would like to see the review of the public accounts in this forum done earlier, from the perspective that it's fresh in our minds, and it's also, maybe precedes the budget review, in which it could be very informative. What's in the public accounts helps with that discussion on the budget. So I do agree with committee on that front, and so we are flexible in when we're able to appear in front of committee for that review. Anytime after the statements are signed and we publish them, so between November, December, January. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I'll sneak in a couple questions here. I'm wondering, and I think this perhaps is more of a budgeting finance question. Often line items are changing and moving, and so there's no real way for us to go through and say, how much has the GNWT been spending on homelessness over the last 10 years? I mean, we go to the Housing Corp and we could find some line items in health, but often shelter funding gets moved around. And I think that would be the kind of public information that people would really like to see, you know. Education might be easier. You could pull all of the DEA budgets and put them together and map them over 10 years and have a trend, you know, of what we're spending. But and capital is very difficult to do because so much gets lapsed. So it's really hard to actually figure out where projects are. But I'm just wondering, in perhaps the non-consolidated financial statements, or in the analysis piece, whether there's an ability to kind of group together some line items into categories that, you know, would probably be much more useful for the public or MLAs. And I think there's some, you know, high level ones that people are interested in, especially when line items change year to year in the budget. So I'll turn that over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's something that I'll have to take back under consideration and see, you know, what might be possible and in what form, because the public accounts isn't necessarily the only place where we can disclose that type of information, but certainly from a public accounts perspective, happy to take that back to see what's possible. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, and I guess this ties back into a conversation we had about digitalization. So what we work off of usually is the table document in PDF form, and we ask our staff to then, can you go pull out every single contract services line for the last 10 years from, you know, these departments, and then can you put it in an Excel spreadsheet and then give it to us in a graph? Nowhere is, you know, just an Excel spreadsheet version of all of the previous year's data available, and I can tell you we would really like to kind of be able to manipulate that data to perhaps much easily find, you know, health authority spending without having to pull all previous year's PDFs. So I guess I'll ask if you would be able to take that back, and perhaps there is a bit of a machine readable format or an Excel version of existing information with previous years that could be published somewhere. That would be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the things that we've been looking at in terms of transparency, accessibility of the information, you know, finding a format that's maybe has more explanatory information is certainly to improve the public accounts and their accessibility and usability. One of the items that I quickly been, you know, talking internally about was, you know, whether we do also a web-based version. We know other jurisdictions do that. It might be possible to start that with Section 1 and see how that goes. So, you know, certainly I think we can probably make a small step here to see what we can do to provide it a bit more in a different format rather than just a PDF, because that's certainly been on the list of things we've been looking at. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time looking at the way the federal budget is published and the federal actuals, non-consolidated, and yeah, I can assure you a web base would be amazing, and the ability to just grab historical data very easily. And unfortunately for the ledge too, you can only go back so far, and then you hit scan PDFs, which are really unusable. So trying to ask someone to look at a 30-year trend in the GNWT is next to impossible, or it takes the library a whole lot of time and energy. So that's just a comment. With that, I will open it back up to questions from committee. Emily O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just for the record, I agree with the comments that were made about trying to move up the availability of the public accounts for regular MLA, so we can actually have better and more meaningful input into the budgeting process. But I want to turn to one of my favorite topics, environmental liabilities. And I do want to recognize that there has been some improvement over the 6 or 7 years I've been here in terms of reporting of liabilities. At least there's a note now with, it's not just a line item, there's some categorization of the liabilities, but I still don't think it goes far enough. And, you know, especially in light of what, you know, the Yukon now has an online database that you can actually see some of their liabilities. the federal government has the gold standard, as I've called it, where the Treasury Board Secretariat maintains a very detailed inventory. You can zoom in on one site, see all the money that's been spent on that site over a period of time, understand what stage they're at in the remediation process for individual sites, who owns them, who to contact, all kinds of great information. And we've got nothing. We've been in negotiation with the federal government for 7 years on liabilities for some sites that we will inherit some liability for, and it's not booked as even a contingent liability, as I understand it. So what is it that we're going to do to improve the transparency and accountability around our contaminated sites? And I think you're pushing in this direction. But I'm going to keep pushing you folks to get a lot more transparency on this, and I think to better recognize the actual liabilities that we're going to incur in the future with these. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily O'Reilly. Ms. Morchin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So from committee suggestion a number of years ago around an online database, we've been actively working on one. So internally, the Office of the Chief Information Officer's GIS unit has created a map tool, which will actually be available with all the other maps. So it'll be something you can zoom right into. And this will be for GNWT responsible sites. And so we're just really in the final stages of reviewing that work before we launch it on the website, and so we'll certainly circle back to committee once that's done. Very, very close to final work, with a big thanks to a number of departments, because it was an interdepartmental effort to get this work done. And then we'll look forward to committee's feedback on that site, because we do believe in continuous improvement as well. And so we're looking to update this dashboard on an annual basis as we update the public accounts. We streamline the processes together. It includes, description information, which is a bit more than had been included in a prior version you might have seen. So we'll look forward to committee's, feedback on that once we launch it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily O'Reilly.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, and I eagerly await the public launch of this database and GIS system, whatever it's going to be. But how are we going to better recognize and disclose contingent liabilities in this area? Like the bars for actually getting something on the books seem to be really high to me. You've got to have a risk assessment done, an ERA, I think a phase 2. You have to have it actually recognized as close to humans and as receptors, and that somebody's going to potentially be at a health risk. There's all these barriers to actually getting something recognized as a liability. And at the same time, we're negotiating a bunch of sites with the federal government. We're going to take financial hits for those at some point. So, and I don't believe that they're even recognized as any kind of contingent liability, as we do recognize when somebody's going to sue us. That's entered as a liability somehow, but for a contaminated site, we just kind of throw up our hands and say, well, we don't know what it is. Is there not some better way of starting to book contingent liability for some of these contaminated sites that we will inherit and that are going to cause problems in the future? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily O'Reilly. Ms. Morchin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, similar to comments, earlier, we are following public sector accounting standards. And so, I think this is something we'll have to take back in terms of whether there is other information we can include. Of course, we'll have to look at, how available information is and where it would be appropriate to put that. But certainly, like the claims and litigation number that you've seen, that's not something that's actually been booked as a liability. So it's not included in the financial statements. It's been disclosed, for transparency. But we'll see what in this area, is possible. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you. Emily O'Reilly?
Yeah, thanks. Okay, I appreciate that. I'm just going to give one concrete example here. You know, we got the Ptarmigan mine down on the Ingram Trail. GNWT has some liability for that site. It's currently under negotiation with the federal government for 7 years, but GNWT has actually paid for some environmental risk assessment work to be done at the site. There was an Environmental Rights Act investigation that was done. GNWT, as I understand it, is going to be applying a surfactant to the tailings area to try to prevent tailings from blowing all over the place. So we've actually expended money on that site before we've even accepted any responsibility for it. So all of those kind of costs that have been incurred, I don't know how much they are, and I think, but the public deserves to know at some point how much we've actually spent on some of these sites. So that's the kind of thing that I think, you know, we need to find a way to better categorize those kinds of expenditures that our government's already made, disclose them, and what the actual, at the end of the day, what we're going to have to pay to clean up an area. So anyways, that's just a concrete example of one down the road from us that Yellowknifers are very familiar with, and I just think we can and should be doing a lot better in this area. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Didn't hear much of a question there, but Ms. Morgan, any comment? Questions? MLA O'Reilly, any further questions? Yeah. I do have a question. Ms. Morgan, if you could just speak to what financial information will be included in the contaminated sites registry. I know there is perhaps some concern about if we have a Class D cost estimate and we're planning to go out to tender it the next week, you know, that may affect tendering. But also I know the feds have quite a bit of numerical information of what things actually are going to cost. They're estimated. And so I'm just wondering if you could speak to what, if any, kind of estimates of the cleanup will be in the registry. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. At this time, the tool is not including costs, you know, based primarily on, you know, comments you've made as well there on potential, you know, implications for procurement. So at this moment, it's the site, some detail around it, the classification of the site, coordinates, but does not include numerical, like, cost information. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions from committee? Emily O'Reilly?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I think earlier I recognized that there have been some big improvements to the public accounts in the 7 years I've been here, so I want to acknowledge that again. I think they're much easier to understand. There's been some greater disclosure through the notes. We've got a better financial statement disclosure and discussion and analysis, and this one is really a big improvement over what I've seen before. So I want to give you folks lots of credit for that. But I wonder how you look at how we could increase transparency and disclosure. You know, have you done any looking at other jurisdictions? There are international standards around this that the auditing profession itself has developed or starting to talk about. And yeah, I know you talk about some things that are on the horizon, but you know, the International Monetary Fund has developed a series of transparency policies and pillars in different areas. Is that something that you folks ever have the time to look at beside trying to just manage our own accounts and so on? But I think that there's probably some value in looking at how lessons learned from other jurisdictions and within Canada, but even at the international level, about how we can improve transparency and disclosure. So if you have time to do that, and if not, what would it take to get that work done? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily O'Reilly. Ms. Morchin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A pretty comprehensive jurisdictional scan was done back in 2020 by the team, and so we have a lot of that information available to us to help inform, you know, what we do next, as well as what committee has you know, spoken about today and in previous meetings. So we sort of take that all together and we look for, you know, one of the big gaps that we saw back then was that we did not have a consolidated budget. and we have now done that for several years. And so we just continue to look at what other jurisdictions are doing, whether it's something we can do based on our resources. You know, there are things like the Yukon, for example, has their discussion before their statements. You know, we looked at, that's an interesting way to do it. Should we maybe do it that way? Certainly there's other jurisdictions that have tables that are really easy to read. Maybe we could look at those in the future. So definitely based on our resources, we start to include year-over-year improvements. And certainly when it comes to transparency, it's also about how accessible the statements are in terms of the financial highlights we did in 2021 had some information that we thought would be useful for a new reader to understand what the financial highlights were for the year. So it's those kinds of improvements we continue to do as you know time allows, but certainly it's top of mind and part of our year-end process to do so. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Emily O'Reilly. Any further questions from committee? Okay, I had one on tangible capital assets. As I mentioned before, we have $3.67 billion in tangible capital assets and on our net book value. And this number is relevant for a couple things. One, it informs our deferred maintenance budget, which is hundreds of millions of dollars in backlog, just excluding roads and bridges. The roads and bridges we have yet, infrastructure is yet to even classify what the state they're in, what repairs they need, but it's also hundreds of millions of dollars. And then this number is actually, well, for us, it's we do a similar number for all the municipalities of their tangible capital assets, and then that's how we fund them based on their net book value. So not this number, but a similar calculation. But one of the issues I've had repeatedly is I've asked infrastructure to how many tangible capital assets do we actually have? And this is the number they always give me, despite the fact that I think we're in a state where the majority of our assets have been amortized and are still in use. So it's not an accurate picture, and that's similarly true for municipalities. They are not getting funding for things that are not being calculated because they're long past amortization. And so a bit of a question is whether it would be possible or easy for a different number to be provided to committee that showed, you know, how much do we actually own in assets? That's a number I've never been able to get. Or whether there is any work being done in light of kind of asset retirement obligations and the increasing liability there to revisit this net book value and see whether it's actually accurate. I think prime example is most of our hydro infrastructure is not included in this because it's long since been amortized. I'm just wondering if the office could speak to that or look into this figure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think, you know, the way we've accounted for it is, you know, correct in accounting terms. That being said, I know the Office of the Auditor General spoke about this earlier, which is reviewing assets that are still in use with zero book value, and so that's part of the year-end process. You know, as far as a different number in the public accounts, it would be not likely possible. But when it comes to asset retirement obligations and that new standard, that's really trying to put a number on what that liability will be to retire an asset, with the caveat that that standard only exists for where there's a legal liability or contractual obligation to retire. So it doesn't necessarily cover the cost of the entire asset. So that, you know, liability will be there for the 23 public accounts. But, you know, in terms of other, you know, book values for the public accounts, you know, we're following, you know, our accounting policies. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you. And I think perhaps it's maybe also an area that could have some focus on the financial analysis, and that, you know, we all talk regularly about our infrastructure deficit and the state of our infrastructure, and every capital budget we talk about just we could eat up $10 billion tomorrow and still be, you know, not even close to repairing our infrastructure. So I think it's an even more relevant conversation at the municipal level, where they're actually seeing water and sewer services, you know, despite having an asset on their book, they in no way budgeted or planned to replace them, and we have seen them fail. in our territory. So I think there's just this figure as being a positive $3.7 billion doesn't quite reflect the importance that we need to be tracking this. So that's a bit of a comment on public accounting. Any further questions, comments from committee? With that, I will thank you very much for your work and your ongoing work to improve the public accounts and meeting with committee. We look forward to further conversations. With that, I will adjourn the public portion of our meeting.